Travel with me to Utah. This is near the Four Corners area, near Blanding, Utah, under the arches at Natural Bridges National Monument. And here, Dr. Swift down there, who was working with me, is pointing up where the arrow is to a protected area where the Anasazi Indians did their petroglyphs about 1,000 years ago, according to the park rangers. And you climb up there on that little ledge and look at that, and you see a number of the petroglyphs. It's covered with heavy desert varnish so that it's difficult to photograph. But right over my head, you see the Anasazi warrior and then the snakes. But then right beside me, if we highlight the significant area, you can see the dinosaur, which even the secular archaeologists have acknowledged sure looks like a dinosaur, and covered with the varnish so that the antiquity is really not questioned. We go not too far from there, but over in Colorado, we see the three-horned dinosaur with the frill on its back. It looks more like a triceratops than the people. Look like people. This is done by the Fremont Indians, who were contemporary with the Anasazi. And then we go to the Grand Canyon. We see what appears to be in the shape of maybe an Allosaurus. Someone shot him in the tail, which shows you what it looks like if you break through that heavy desert varnish, which indicates its antiquity. There was a write-up by a representative for the American Museum of Natural History in 1924 of this site describing Indians drawing dinosaurs, though they wouldn't do that today. Not because the evidence is not there, they just wouldn't do it. We traveled down to Peru, and this is Dr. Javier Cabrera, who was 20 years head of the Department of Medicine at the University of Lima, retired to be cultural anthropologist in Inca, ancestor of the conquistadors, has a big 300-year-old castle there on the town square, and has a collection of Inca burial stones that begun to be made by his father back in the 30s. He's continued that collection. These are stones that are buried with in the tombs with the Incas, and they have scenes carved over them, most of them. He has a collection now of over 11,000 of these burial stones. About a third of them are the most disgusting pornography you've ever seen, but about a third of them have dinosaurs on them. Here is one in place in the tomb, but looking at a close-up of these stones, you can see the rather artistic rendition of the dinosaur. Interestingly, this one has the dermal frills on its back. When Mr. Sinclair did his sign with the dinosaur, he didn't know that it had frills on its back, but they did it right. This was written up in Geology magazine in 1992 for the first time, and we found them well preserved. But there are thousands of these stones. This is one of the larger ones. Again, rather artistically rendered. Looking at a close-up, you can see the dinosaur in the upper right-hand corner with the man foot in his mouth. All shapes and sizes and types of stones and styles of rendering, certainly not done by the same individual. Some of them are almost oriental looking, and some of them rather literal looking. Here's one with a number of different species on it, but thousands of them. We have a number of others who have collected as well. We have a collection at the Aeronautical Museum in Lima. There were hundreds here. There are 40 that are left. They've been raided, I think sold maybe illegally. But you can still see the stones, some of the ones that are not as elaborate and beautiful as in the Cabrera collection, but obviously recognizable. Still in the National Aeronautical Museum, there's also a display in the Naval Museum, and at least 2 other museums that I know of in Peru. Some of them are still being excavated. This was one that was excavated in 2006 that is in the artifact room. It has 2 dinosaurs on it. Slightly different type stone from Cabrera's, raised instead of incised, but still the same general picture. Also in the tombs you find burial cloths with the same kind of motif there. Obviously, the big claws and the teeth representing dinosaurs. You see it on their pottery. That's relatively easy to date. These are dated at about 2,500 years ago. These are the mochi pots, and the style is well known and documented and represented in the national museums. This one's in the National Museum in Lima. It says circa 2,500 years ago. Up in northern Peru, you have a good deal of gold in some of the ruins and tombs. This is a death mask, but look on either side of the face. Again, the dermal frills across the back, the tail curling up over, and the huge teeth. These people were seeing dinosaurs 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Now, we're told that we've known what dinosaurs look like for maybe, well, the first ones found in 1820. We didn't know what they looked like very well. The restorations were silly. After the turn of the century, early 1900s, we got a fair idea, and really not an excellent idea. And, well, 1992, we learned the Brontosaurus type had frills on its back. These people didn't show a gradation in learning. They got it right from the start. But what's really interesting about these burial stones collected by Cabrera and a number of others is the fact that they depict dinosaurs. Here is one of the large stones here in the center of a room he has built for displaying this in the front of his 300-year-old mansion. He is a descendant of the conquistadors. This is one of the castles they built, and he lives in it. And of course, he passed away in 2002. But looking closely at this stone, you can see the very obvious dinosaur with the dermal frills on its back, a man sitting atop fighting, evidently. And then we look at the top of the stone, and we see it's ornately covered with carvings. And a closer view, you see the upper right-hand corner, the very obvious sauropod dinosaur with the man in his mouth, dangling by the foot. Beautifully and artistically done in stone. But there are thousands of these. Some 11,000 burial stones have been collected by the Cabreras. About a third of them are this disgusting pornography, and then about a third of them are of dinosaurs. Here we see many of them are shown with man associated, but in battle. Here he's chopping the neck. In this one, he's already chopped the neck and holding the head in his hand of possibly a juvenile form, but then looks like Mama has got him from behind, or at least another younger one attacking him, and together with a much larger one on the same stone. Another one here is being bitten as he rides on the back. Notice the variety in styles. This is rather Oriental in style. Very different, but obviously very similar. This one's very, maybe literalistic, if you please. Some almost cartoonish. Another Oriental style dinosaur. This beautiful stone is almost 4 feet tall. Again, very artistically done with the dermal frills on the back, which were written up for the first time in Geology magazine in 1992. When Mr. Sinclair depicted his dinosaur on the Sinclair dinosaur sign, he didn't know it had dermal frills on the back, but they did down in Peru over 2,000 years ago, and here we see them depicted on the stones. It looks like a scene maybe out of Jurassic Park. No question about the species that's depicted here. Some rather artistically and stylistically done, cartoonish, and then very literal. Here are a number of different species depicted on the same stone. Again, a tremendous variety is obvious. One person, again, did not do this. But this is not the only museum that depicts dinosaurs on the burial stones. Another very interesting display of these stones is seen in the museum there in Inca. It was actually established by Dr. Cabrera over 20 years ago. They have a collection, but they will not display it. We had talked to the brother of Carlos Solti, Pablos, who had donated the collection to the museum about 15 years ago, and we had seen pictures of the stones that he had donated. His brother had excavated them in the 50s near the village of Okekehi, and then donated this to the museum upon the death of his brother. We went there, said, we want to see this collection. They said, it doesn't exist, that's a myth. We said, we've seen the pictures, we've talked to the one who donated the collection. They said, well, yes, okay, it does exist, but they're in storage and you can't see them. We insisted, saying this is a museum that's not supposed to hide things, it's supposed to show things. They said, well, you can't do this unless you're authorized by an official museum with 48 hours notice. We said, we think we can handle that, and we did. We got a letter from an official state-authorized museum authorizing us to examine them. With 48 hours notice, we came back. They still refused. They said, you will not be allowed to examine these. They were stonewalling. Dr. Swift eventually did gain access last year and got pictures, and yes, they are virtually, well, they are the same as the ones that we see in the Yules collection with dinosaurs on them. We did get to examine the ones in the collection at the Aeronautical Museum in Lima, pictured here. Years ago, there were many more. They have disappeared over the years. There were several hundred initially. There are about 40 that remain. But here we see one on the floor in the room where they are displayed, and these are the poorer ones. The better ones have disappeared, but you can still see the dinosaurs on the stones displayed in the Aeronautical Museum in Lima. In the museum in Nazca, likewise, they have some of the carved stones on display. And here we see Dr. Swift laboring as he holds up one of the stones for the camera. The stones are exhibited in the Cabrera Museum, where there are 11,000 of them, in the Museum of Inca, where they're hidden, and they wouldn't allow us to see them. Dr. Swift did eventually get, and then Nazca Museum and the Aeronautical Museum and the Naval Museum. But we see here the museums which have these stones, all but one of them have them on display that can be seen today. We traveled to the village of Okekehi, where a number of these stones, or at least in the area, where a number of these stones had been excavated in the 50s by Carlos Solti, who was the rector of the College of Engineers in Lima. And there we see an obviously very depressed area. We see individuals who just eking out a living. Basilio Achua is one of the individuals here who has found a number of these stones and had taken them to Dr. Cabrera. He took us out to the place where many had been excavated, and we could see the actual tombs and see some of the stones in the tombs. As we walked along this desolate area, you could see the bones that had been strewn along the way by the grave robbers, who weren't interested in the bones at all, but in the artifacts that they could dig out to sell. In these tombs, you see amazing preservation, even of flesh parts. In an area where it hasn't rained for 100 years, the dryness of the desert is excellent for preservation. But in these tombs, you can see the remains of the mummies. This is a trophy head that was worn on the belt by this brutal culture. In one of the nearby museums, you see the skulls with a hole in the head. This means that was a trophy head. It had been worn by somebody who had evidently killed them in battle. But as we look at these tombs, we see often babies with mothers. Maybe if the mother died, they couldn't take care of the babies. And I don't know the whole story, but it doesn't look like a nice story. Here we see one of the well-preserved mummies together with a number of bones that have been found in the area. And in this particular tomb, you see one of the burial stones in situ, in place. And you see this on a number of occasions. Here's another one of the burial stones beside one of the mummies with a dinosaur on it. This one was excavated in 2005. The drawing here shows what's seen on it, not as dramatically clear as with some of them, but it can be seen very clearly. It has been examined carefully by a number of laboratories, and we see the close-up of some of the carvings showing the patina in the grooves also testifying to its antiquity. This was one that was excavated in 2006 that is in a collection that I own. This is about a 70-pound stone. It has 3 dinosaurs on it. It was from about 100 miles away from the Paracas Peninsula, and the carving style is slightly different. You can see the teeth are raised rather than incised. The bias relief is in evidence here, but the same style, again depicting the dinosaurs. Many say, well, Cabrera was a strange fella, and we can't depend on his testimony. Well, I think he was a very credible witness, but we have many, many different sources. Notice that the first one is the Spanish priest who in 1525 described these stones, and there have been several reports of this. The chronicler of the Incas wrote of these stones in 1570. In detail, they found the stones with the strange animals on them. And then Bolivia Cabrera, the grandfather of the one that we worked with there, began collecting the stones in the 30s, and then Javier Cabrera continued the collection, amassing some 11,000 of the stones. He was professor of medicine at the University of Lima, head of the Department of Medicine for 20 years. He established the largest teaching hospital in Peru and retired to be cultural anthropologist for Inca. This is not a lightweight in terms of a witness, but if you want to ignore him, there are many others. There's Carlos Solti, who excavated the stones at Ocoqueji in the 50s. Pablo Solti, who is his brother, donated the stones to the museum in 1968. The museum denied it, promised to show them to us if we met their conditions, and then refused, but then finally did reveal them. Yes, they have them there. And then Basilio Achua of Ocoqueji excavated a number of the stones. The Aeronautical Museum displays many of the stones today, as does the Regional Museum in Nazca. I, together with Dr. Swift, have observed them in the tombs in situ. University of Bonn in Germany has confirmed the oxidized patina in a number of the stones, and grave robbers continue to excavate these carved stones. You can still dig them up. Now, that's an impressive array of confirmation. And if you don't like Dr. Cabrera, then okay, toss him out. You still have an impressive array of confirmation. In addition to the stones, we find in the tombs other things that display the dinosaurs, like the textiles, the burial cloths that were associated with them. Many of them show the dinosaur motif, as do the vases, the pottery. This is in the National Museum in Lima. It has a sign circa 2,500 years before present. And then the Moshi vases, very famous for their style, inability to reproduce them. They're showing clearly dinosaurs. And then some of the gold death masks that were found up in northern Peru likewise show the dinosaurs. Notice the dermal frills on the back, the huge teeth, the tail curving up over their back on either side of the face here. It's obvious that the people of Peru were seeing dinosaurs from their vases and their death masks and their textiles, as well as the thousands of stones that can be seen today. I think that's just really irrefutable evidence. Likewise in Mexico, we've made a number of trips there in central highlands near Acámbaro in the state of Guanajuato. Dr. Swift and I have been down there a number of times investigating. It took that many times to get through all the bureaucracy. When we got there, they were being hidden in the back of the police department. But it was a collection made by Waldemar Julsrud back in the early 1900s of some 30,000 ceramic figurines, about 10% of which are of dinosaurs, but a wide range of animals and creatures. Some of the Brontosaurus type were standing up. We didn't know that until recently. Bacher's book, Dinosaur Heresies, published in '86, was really the first one who suggested that. And then, of course, Spielberg convinced us all they stood up. But this is exactly the way they're rendered by the artist, and these date to well before the time of Christ from several sources. Again, there are thousands of them, and the styles indicate far more than one artist. One of the professors from the University of Texas at Arlington, who is an art professor, said there were at least 100 different artists represented in the collection, would be his estimate. This is my wife's favorite. Obviously, if you've got one that looks like a dinosaur, a man did it, but sewing them together is interesting. Man and dinosaur obviously live together. You pick up any of the dinosaur books today, and how does it start out? Millions and millions of years ago. And then the second paragraph says, no man ever saw a dinosaur. And that's just like you can't write a dinosaur book unless you start that way. And then in 2000, and actually we've made about a dozen trips now. When we first got there, this is the scene that depicts where they were. And actually, they were locked in this door that you see in the background, behind that door with a padlock in the back of the police department. They were hoping nobody would find out about it. They were hidden and had been there for about 30 years. Why? Well, this is an embarrassment. You're not supposed to find evidence of humans and dinosaurs, and they wanted to appear intelligent. And it took a great deal of effort to get that door open. But we finally did, and with pressure, actually, from outside sources, political pressure, we were able to examine 2 of the 60 crates of materials that were stored behind that door the first time that we came down. And sure enough, even in just the 2 crates, which is a random sampling of over 60, we found strange ceramic figurines, including figurines of dinosaurs. The second time we came down, we were able to examine more crates, still not all of them, but here we have a number of them spread out on the table. Dr. Swift is actually mocking the great security with which these were guarded. They had a soldier there with an AK-47 guarding us, and as we looked at these figurines, he grabbed it from him and posed with the figurines. But they had been, of course, under lock and key. Nobody could see them. But with our investigation, we finally brought them to light and were able to make photographic record of a number of these. We see in this picture an amazing variety, both of ethnicity and styles and materials that are reflected in these figurines. Of the 33,000, about 2,600 of them are of dinosaurs, and I think you can see that very obviously here. One amazing thing about the sauropod types is that many of them were shown standing upright. We didn't know about this until Robert Bacher told us this in Dinosaur Heresies in his book 1986. But it looks like he had one of the Acámbaro figurines shown here on the right as a model for what he illustrated in his book, Dinosaur Heresies. Of course, then Spielberg convinced us all that they stood upright. But 3,000 years ago, obviously they knew that down in Acámbaro. Now, this is what we thought dinosaurs looked like way back in about 1850. This is supposed to be a picture of an iguanodon, one of the earliest dinosaurs that were excavated. Well, that's not very close, but that's what we thought in 1850. By the turn of the century, this was 1895, we had him depicted differently, kind of a stand-up alligator with a long tail dragging the floor. Not very accurate, but closer. But now then we know that iguanodon looked like this. This is a restoration from the year 2000. So now we've got a pretty good idea. Notice the almost horse-like head and the tail that sticks out right. The ossified tendons along the tail show that it was stood outright like a bird. If it drooped to the ground, that meant it was broken. But notice how the people in Acámbaro depicted this over 3,000 years ago. Just almost identical to what we now have finally learned. This is the way they looked when we first started in the 1800s, 1900s, but now then we know it looks like this, and the folks in Acámbaro got it right 3,000 years ago, as they did with the stand-up sauropods. Another figurine appears to look just like the ankylosaur that we see depicted here. Very, very similar. There's a wide range. I suppose sauropods are the most popular, but 2,600 of these that I've examined. I have 20,000 digital images that I personally took of this collection. We've examined it carefully. Here are flying pterosaurs, and a totally different style, different materials, obviously a different artist. Some of the critics have said, well, it's all made by the same fella in a short period of time, and the numbers were to impress people. 33,000 is kind of overkill, isn't it? And certainly there's a tremendous variety of styles and materials not made out of the same stuff, as is obvious to an objective observer, but a bewildering array of mysterious creatures. What in the world were these for? I think the most reasonable explanation is that they were apropopadic. This is a fancy word that archaeologists use, actually coined from the investigations over in Mesopotamia, where they found caches of these buried under the threshold of dwellings, or where dwellings had been. And we find these often in caches of 20 up to 30 packed in sand, surrounded, of course, by the clay soil. And it would appear that they were buried carefully. Some have suggested maybe the enemies were coming and they buried their gods, their idols, to protect them from the invasion. I strongly suspect they were like the apropopadic figurines in Mesopotamia that were buried under the threshold to ward off evil spirits. And that's what this fancy word means. It's to scare off the evil spirits. Well, if you're going to scare off spirits, I suppose dinosaur figurines would be as efficient as any. But the bottom line, we don't know. These are several different ideas that have been proposed. It's interesting to notice again that in 2,600 you've got a tremendous variety, and the association with people seems to be closer and more frequent with the juvenile forms. I think I can understand that if you watch Jurassic Park, but some of the juvenile forms are depicted and they're kind of cute, and we can see why humans might be more closely associated with these forms. We also find, besides dinosaurs, other out-of-place figurines. Here is a horse. This is typical of the Pleistocene horse, Ice Age, which wasn't supposed to be in Mexico till the Spaniards brought the horses. Here is another one that is with a man trying to ride it, who has lost his head. It's broken in this figurine. But an amazing turn of events involves the find of the unfossilized tooth of a Pleistocene horse associated with the Pleistocene horse itself. This tooth was identified by George Gaylord Simpson of Harvard, who is the leading expert on fossil horses, was the leading expert in the world. Well, here is the Pleistocene horse, here is the Pleistocene tooth, unfossilized, found with it. The mystery deepens, or at least maybe the picture, contrary to the standard evolutionary picture, is getting more difficult. We went back to try to verify Gardner's research. I think he did an excellent job. We thought, well, let's just look and see if we can repeat what he did and re-verify. We wanted to do original excavations, and we approached this with some of the leading experts to get permits, and permits have to be obtained from INA. This is the Institute of Archaeology there in Mexico, and we applied 3 different times with the University of Texas first, and then with David Soleil, who at the time was director of the Museum of the Rockies. He's actually Jack Horner's boss. Jack Horner is the individual, if you saw Jurassic Park, the real-life character that the story is based on. He's the fellow represented as digging up dinosaurs up in Montana. Well, his boss, the director of Museum of the Rockies, David Soleil, went with us, and we applied together for permits, and they were all denied. And we were told firmly, actually the mayor of Acámbaro was told, that we would never be given a permit, that the implications would not be allowed. Actually, we found out that INA had done their own investigation back in 1953. They sent 4 archaeologists to Acámbaro to do official excavations there. They chose their own site over a mile away from Yulsrud site, and they found figurines, a number of them 6 feet down, including dinosaurs, and acknowledged that the figurines were authentic, but not so with the dinosaurs, which were found in the same place by them at the same time, at the same level, together. They couldn't be, and we actually intercepted the interdepartmental memo, and we have exactly what they said about this. And this is from a memo dated February 24th, 1954. Apparently those artifacts were gathered scientifically, but even so, they are reproductions of relatively recent times, and they're talking here about the dinosaurs. In our opinion, it is impossible that man existed at the same time as those saurian that lived millions of years ago. So they're acknowledging, yes, they are dinosaur figurines, but they could not have been with man, and so they just simply deny it. Continuing, they say, it's our opinion, in our opinion, the only archaeological artifacts are the collections of vessels and other Chipiquaro pieces that they found at the same time. These are authentic and represent great archaeological value for our studies. So in the same hole at the same time, they found authentic ones, but dinosaurs with them couldn't be, and so they just deny it. That's why it is the philosophical pressure that says you cannot have humans and dinosaurs together. That would destroy the picture of evolution that's in the textbooks. And so here's what's real and here's what's not based on the evidence, but based on the philosophical conclusions. Year before last, we traveled to Cambodia, following evidence that had been forwarded to us by one of the tour guides there who had seen our website. And we had done some research and confirmed a good bit of what he was telling us. In the upper part of Cambodia, we see the ancient Khmer Empire had built just spectacular temples, maybe the largest and most beautiful in the world. And one of the greatest monument builders was Jayavarman VII. He's almost idolized. This is a picture that I took there in Phnom Penh of the Buddha-like pose. He began to rule in 1181 and built Tapram and dedicated it in 1186. This was dedicated to his mother. It was a Buddhist monastery. And so we know who and when and all the specifics. Well, on the stone in this temple, a very beautiful, picturesque place, you see carvings, and they're stone carvings that cover just about every square inch of it. But just inside the front entrance, in the corner here that the arrow points to, you can see a series of animals from the jungle. And notice in the series there is a perfect stegosaurus in a temple from over 800 years ago. And we're supposed to have known what dinosaurs looked like for about 150, and then they've been gone 65 million. I believe there's something wrong with that story. I don't want any comments about 2 fossils here, or 2 dinosaurs. They're just one. But it is more proof of the co-occurrence of humans and dinosaurs. Let's think about some significance here of this, acknowledged by the evolutionists before we conclude. Louis Jacobs from SMU is president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, one of the most representative, respected paleontologists in the country. And in his book, Quest for the African Dinosaur, he brings up the subject of the co-occurrence of men and dinosaurs. He said such an association would dispel an earth with vast antiquity. The entire history of creation, including the day of rest, could be accommodated in the 7 biblical days of the Genesis myth. This is, of course, his view of it. Evolution would be vanquished. Here's the implication, the significance, if you were to document this. And, of course, I think he's right. Now, we go back to the statement by Stephen Stanley that we referred to earlier, the topsy-turvy fossil man, and look at a fuller context of his quote. He said, "There's an infinite variety of ways in which, since 1859, the general concept of evolution might have been demolished. Consider the fossil record, little-known resource in Darwin's day. The unequivocal discovery of a fossil population of horses in Precambrian rocks would disprove evolution. More generally, any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory, and yet not a single one has come to light. As Darwin recognized, a single geographic inconsistency would have nearly the same power of destruction." But these are his terms: destruction, destroy, disprove. That's the implication if you find humans and dinosaurs together, specifically. A single geographic inconsistency. It's interesting to listen to what the evolutionists themselves say about what this would mean. Stanley says it would disprove evolution. Dawkins, referring to another find, says evolution would be utterly destroyed, and then Jacob says evolution would be vanquished. Now, that's not my analysis. That's the leading evolutionist across the country. That's what they say such evidence means. If you've got a single geographic inconsistency, well, I believe we've shown more than a single geographic inconsistency. The Malachite man with the 10 perfectly modern human skeletons, the same formation as Dinosaur National Monument, fossil footprints in Texas and New Mexico and Turkmenistan, 3 different places in Texas, the dinosaur petroglyphs, Peruvian Mexican dinosaur artifacts, the burial stones, the cat track and the hammer, and that's a whole lot more than a single geographic inconsistency, and I think the implication is just as they suggested. It demolishes. It is, the column itself is an abstraction that's put together based on the assumption of evolution, useful as a model that we can test against the real world, and when we do, we find it fails. It is contradicted. It's not proof. It is a demonstration of what ought to be that isn't. And let's conclude with a statement by Nova, who came to Glen Rose, looked at the same pictures that you looked at. The people that photographed it and interviewed us were excited. They thought they had some earth-shaking news and went back, and the editor wouldn't allow them to publish it. They did publish a brief presentation called God, Darwin, and the Dinosaurs, and mentioned dinosaur footprints side by side with humans. Finding them would counter evidence, they said, that humans evolved long after the dinosaurs became extinct, which is, of course, what's taught in the textbooks. It would counter that and back up the claim that all species, including man, were created at one time. Nova knows what that means. And therefore, they said in this blurb, there's nothing at Glen Rose that looks anything like a footprint, a human footprint. Now, you can decide for yourself whether that's true. If there's something there that does look like, and we've shown that there are human footprints there and that that's the most reasonable conclusion, then this is what it means, according to the evolutionists themselves. We look in the textbooks of stratigraphy, tell us about the sedimentation rates. This is by Schuster. It's still in all the textbooks. And this is the standard conclusion about how long it takes to form 1 foot of Paleozoic limestone, 2,700 years. That's the majority of it. It's different rates for different portions, we're told, according to Schuster. Now, some would have it much, much older. This is actually a very conservative estimate. In 96, this book was published making the statement a rate of 1 centimeter per 1,000 years is typical. Now, that's over 30,000 years per foot. Most would say that's rather extreme, though these people from Yale and Dartmouth are very representative authorities. 30,000 years, or even 3,000 years a foot, is how this sediment accumulates and how the rocks form. It kind of reminds me of the Family Circus cartoon. The little boy says, how big does a stone have to grow before it becomes a rock? It's growing real slow. Do rocks grow? Have you seen? Or do they deteriorate? If they grew even at the slow rate, you just wait long enough and you got a rock house, you could have an extra bedroom and a new den. And rocks don't do that. They deteriorate, and we should understand that, but that's not the propaganda that's put out. Notice the picture here of the beautiful fossil spider, wolf spider, the fluorescent fossil beds. And there's a sign there at this national monument that says, remember, 2 inches equals 1 million years. Now that's slower than Officer and Page, but still on the order of what you typically hear. This is what we're paying for with our tax dollars. Now, just think about this for a minute. This is the width of a human hair. How long is it going to take to cover that hair at 2 inches per million years? At Schuster's rate, that's the one that's faster than the others. 2,500 years would be required to cover one hair. And what's going to happen to the spider as it's being covered at that rate? Is it still going to be there? You're going to sit there and hold still for 2,500 years while the rock grows around it. That's the kind of thing you see in the textbooks. That doesn't even make good nonsense. If you just think, I mean, it doesn't hurt. Just think about it. There's no way that that's going to happen. Dunbar and Rogers, in their Principles of Stratigraphy, talked about this problem as a dilemma. When you look at the rocks and you see the fossils and try to imagine how this could happen slowly, you've got a problem. He says to some thoughtful stratigrapher, this amazing discovery, billions of years, presented a dilemma. For if the known stratified rocks have been accumulating throughout this vast span of time, the average rate of deposition must have been extremely slow. 3,000 years to form a foot, the faster rate instead of 30,000. Yet there is very good evidence that individual beds accumulated rapidly. Very good evidence. Now, where's the evidence, good or otherwise, that it happened slowly? No, the evidence is the opposite. What's he talking about? Well, we look at this shrimp, which is really not accurate. This is not a shrimp. This is a rock. And my question is, how long did it take that rock to form? Now just think about that. You know the shrimp is going to lay out there on the beach after it dies for years, days. How long? You ladies know you can put the shrimp in the refrigerator and it'll just stay there for years and years and years. How long is this shrimp going to look like this before it's solidified into rock? Well, if that rock is not formed within days, this picture you can't see. I mean, it just doesn't happen. These are some fish from Ennis County, not too far from where I live. Big, fat, juicy, plump fish that you lay out there in your backyard and it'll stay that way for years and years and years. How long are these fish going to stay this way? They became a rock while they still were looking like this. How long did it take that rock to form? We're looking here at a picture of a fish eating his supper, a heron and a perch, which are very similar to modern ones, supposed to be 135 million years old. The big one here is about 3 feet long. I enjoy eating with my brethren from time to time, and some of them we kid about being kind of slow in their eating processes. But thousands of years is kind of not. I mean, how long did it take this fish to become a rock? He got caught eating his supper. He got caught in the concrete, if you please, fast forming concrete. We're looking here at a fern, but this fern has not had time to wilt, and it became a rock. This one is bent over, as is the live fern that we see below it. Obviously, before it wilted, how long does it take a fern to wilt? You ladies know something about that. Just a few minutes sometimes. But this one looks beautiful, and it's a rock. Now, if we just think, we ought to know that this 30,000 years a foot, 2,500 years to cover a hair, propaganda in the textbooks and in our national monuments is just not even good hogwash. We're looking here at about a 43-foot fossil tree trunk. The bottom portion of it is protruding into a coal seam, and the top of it is protruding into a coal seam. And in between you have hundreds of layers of sandstone. The coal seam obviously took hundreds of thousands of years to form. I mean, we all heard that. What's going to happen to the top of the tree while that's happening? Obviously, this is one event. This is not hundreds of thousands of years. What would it take to do something like this? Something like a flood, I think. Dunbar and Rogers again comment, 1,000 years more or less would have been required to bury a shell 5 inches in diameter. This is at the rapid Schuster rate. With very local exceptions, fossil shells show no evidence of such long exposure. Now, as he said, there's very good evidence that they formed rapidly. I want to know where the evidence is that it happened slowly. You look at the seashells. This is one from Dallas, a beautiful ammonite that's still iridescent. Some of the live shells that are iridescent you can lay out in the sunshine, it's gone in an afternoon. This is supposed to have been there for 35 million years. I think it was fossilized very quickly. Some of you will recognize the jellyfish. I had a little girl defining this for us the other night. Well, she said it's just a bunch of snot. A pretty good description of it's not much, you know, it's not very stable. Lays out on the beach for how long after it dies? Long enough to be fossilized. Here are fossils of jellyfish, together with the ripple marks, which likewise don't last very long. A close-up shows even the mouth parts preserved of the jellyfish. Now you think, is it possible to do that slowly? This is an ichthyosaur that looks like a fish. It isn't. It's a reptile. It's about 28 feet long. Frozen in the limestone, Solenhofen limestone in Bavaria. Even some of the soft parts are beautifully preserved. We see the adipose tissue up here on the head, fatty tissue. And then we look closely at the interior and we see this is a Mrs. Ichthyosaur. The embryo is seen. And a number of these obviously were caught in very catastrophic circumstances and buried, and it really upset the Mrs. Ichthyosaurs because numbers of them are involved in premature birth in this one area. They got caught in a big storm and got buried by the sediment, and it really upset them, and here they are giving live birth. And I can sympathize with some of the ladies that think, well, this is going to take 100,000 years to get over. But it really doesn't. Nor did it with Mrs. Ichthyosaur. There is no way to do that. So when you look at the rocks, the geologic phenomena, it says rapid everywhere you look. We talked about evidence for the young Earth. Well, also the evidence why they believe that it's old. Radiometric dating, well, that's not too good. The geologic phenomena is what I really like to talk about. And from that, I think we can see good evidence, as even many of the paleontologists today, perhaps most, would acknowledge. The individual rocks happened rapidly. Dunbar and Rogers, as we saw a moment ago, says there's very good evidence that the individual beds accumulated rapidly. And he's not saying that because it's fun to say for him, but because of the kind of evidence that we were looking at. But you ain't seen nothing yet. Let's look at willow. This is an amazingly preserved dinosaur, North Carolina State University, with heart intact. Now, we see some of these programs where they're trying to transplant the heart, and they get in the helicopter and they put the thing on dry ice and they run across the roof of the hospital and dash into. Because why? It deteriorates quickly. But this became a rot before the heart deteriorated. Here in the museum sign, what are the odds of finding a fossilized dinosaur heart? The seemingly impossible has occurred within the 66-million-year-old skeleton, which they have no doubt about, of course. Here we see the picture of the thorax, the chest, with the heart intact. And they've done CAT scans and all kinds of examination. This shows the clavicle, the collarbone, the neck bone here, but right here in the center is the heart. And there's the right ventricle and the left ventricle of the dinosaur heart. And in the center, the interventricular septum, all beautifully preserved. Now, how long did it take this? Now, this is not a heart. This is a rock. And how long did it take to form? At the rate of 2,500 years, it would cover a hair. I mean, this is idiocy. You just don't have words strong enough to describe the nonsense here. From National Geographic a few years ago, here's a mummified duck-billed dinosaur, 90% covered in soft tissue, stomach contents so well preserved, researchers can tell what he had for his last supper. But, of course, he was covered at the rate of 2,500 years to cover a hair, 30,000 years a foot. But it gets worse. We're looking here at dinosaur blood cells from a T-Rex. Blood cells, of course, last millions of years. Had to be 65 million. And this was what was written in Science Research News back in '93. Round, tiny, nucleated, they were threaded to the bone like red blood cells and blood vessels, but blood cells in a dinosaur should have disappeared eons ago. It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. The bones are, after all, 65 million years old. How could blood cells survive that long? And of course, the author is just asking the question, but there was a furor, and the lady that wrote this lost her job, got in serious trouble. But she decided to do more work, and she persevered and got her doctorate. She is now Dr. Mary Switzer at North Carolina State University, and has continued this investigation and has found some amazing things published just fairly recently. Now, her colleagues will say this is impossible, but she says here it is. This is the squishy, gushy, soft tissue from a T-Rex. Now, I was writing her about this particular specimen, and she acknowledged our current theories do not account for soft tissue and cellular preservation. Never in my wildest dreams would I have predicted what we found. It's certainly not anything like what you see in the textbooks or according to the theories. It was reported in Discover in April of '06, and she was interviewed. She said, I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. And it's not. If it's 65 million years old, he's absolutely right. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. Very scientific. And he's telling the truth, believe me. The evidence doesn't matter. Since then, she's just found a wealth of material in the Tyrannosaurus rex bones, the gushy, stretchy, soft tissue, blood cells, blood vessels, and it is not possible for it to be 65 million years old. The conclusion is these dinosaur fossils cannot be old. It's impossible. And of course, the evolutionist knows that. Even Stephen Gould acknowledges this when he says the sweep of anatomical diversity, all the different forms of anatomy, How many, well, you've got a maximum right after the initial diversification of multicellular animals. In other words, when it starts, that's the way it is. It's more diverse than it is now. The later history of life proceeded by elimination, not expansion. It's going downhill. And it was larger in the past, and we have degenerated. Now, you've read that in your textbook, right? Don't think so. But this textbook acknowledges in this geology text that mammalian life was richer in kinds of larger sizes and had a more abundant expression in the Pliocene than in later times, and you can find expressions like that in all of the periods. Let's just look at a few examples that would help demonstrate this point, beginning with Louis Leakey, who's supposed to be one of the icons of evolution. If you saw Gorillas in the Mist, he's the hero of evolution, who really wasn't, and we'll talk more about that later. But Time magazine, a number of years ago, says he was scouring the gorge since 1931. Over the years, he's unearthed the bones of an ancient pig as big as a rhino. Y'all have all seen pigs like that? A 6-foot-tall sheep, flat-top skull of a wrecked nutcracker man. I think that was a big ape. Pig as big as a rhino. Or you could make a killing in the bacon business, couldn't you? This is a picture of one of those pigs from the Dakota School of Mines. The one on the right is the fossil pig. And if pigs were this big, how big were the rhinos? Here's one from India, 20 feet tall. Back to Louis Leakey's finds, illustrated here in Time magazine, we see the fossil ram that was found there in Africa compared with a modern ram in the background. You can see what's happening here. It's going downhill, isn't it? But of course, man has gotten larger over the years, and we know in the last 50 years that there has been a pretty dramatic increase. Most biologists would say this is because of our knowledge of nutrition and vitamins. We have more to eat and better food to eat. It's not the kind of change that they're looking for to explain evolution. There's been about a 6-inch increase on the average in the past, less than 100 years, actually. But if you increase 6 inches in 100 years and 200 years a foot, and in 400 years 2 feet, and a couple of thousand years ago we were below zero. This is much too fast and not the kind of thing they're looking for. Plus, when we look at the fossil record, we see evidence of large people, which they don't always tell you about. This is Turkana Boy, found by Lewis's son, Richard. He was 5'6", but the interesting thing is he was 9 years old, if they can tell from the teeth. We probably have some 9-year-olds here, but I strongly suspect they're not 5'6". We have, Cro-Magnon man averaged 6'6" in height. Two fossils in Italy found a couple of years ago over 8 feet. They were big in the past. Not all, but many of them were. We excavated this donkey from near Lubbock, Texas, several years ago, 9 feet tall at the shoulder. That kind of messes up the little horse charts, doesn't it? That's not going to work too well, but so they leave him out. In the same area, we excavated a bison with a 12-foot horn span that stood about 11 feet tall at the hump. Y'all have all seen bisons that tall? No. But that's the way it was in the fossil record. And we see the little armadillos running around. You can see the normal size one in the foreground here in this page from a geology textbook. But notice the writing at the bottom. This was 9 times larger than present-day armadillos. Now, when you see these little graduated horse charts and you see the graduated man chart, that is supposed to give the illusion everything's getting bigger. Let me tell you something. You're being lied to. Because every paleontologist knows the very opposite is true. Just a few years ago at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, which I'll be at next week down in Houston, by the way, their annual meeting. They were talking about an armadillo that they found. It was the size of an elephant. That's the way it was described. In fact, in 2004, this news release came from the BBC. Here's a Stone Age elephant twice. Now, elephants are big today. But here were elephants twice as big as the largest modern African elephant. Bones of other large animals, rhinoceros, all of them were bigger. And here we see at the inset the huge tusk for these elephants that were twice as large as modern-day elephants. We're looking here at a fossil turtle that looks for all the world like modern turtles, except this one was 14 feet from one side to the other. You see many 14-foot turtles running around. Here, compared with a 7-foot basketball player, he is dwarfed. From down Big Bend, and it's not because it's from Texas, but there is a big crocodile compared with a modern crocodile here, 50 to 20 feet. National Geographic had a special that dealt with the large crocodiles that were seen in the fossil record just a couple of years ago. And this is typical when you look at the fossil record. We're looking here in the center at a 14-foot shark jaw. That's a good-sized shark, but wow, look at that thing from the fossil record. Jaws is dwarfed by such. We see the great white illustrated. That's a pretty good-sized shark, but nothing like the fossil sharks. We have one of the teeth from the large fossil shark back in our artifact room. Most of us are familiar with our little beavers. They can be pretty aggravating as they go around chewing on branches, but think how aggravating it would be if they were 10 feet long, as is the case in the fossil record. Again, a page from a geology textbook. Here we see a picture from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago of the 10-foot beaver. Science reported just a few years ago a real mighty mouse, 8 million years ago. The buffalo-sized rodents roamed in Venezuela. In fact, Science News reported him as Ratzilla. Glad they're not around. This from 2005 in Syria, a camel foot that indicated a camel, according to the BBC, double the size. Do you get the point? I mean, this just goes on and on and on. This is the way it was. One of my favorites, here described in Wikipedia, is the demon duck of doom. 8 feet tall, 500 pounds, carnivorous. Don't want one of those things after you. Kind of reminiscent of a movie scene.
Fairly alarmed here.
That would alarm us, I think. From Australia, killer kangaroos once roamed Australia. Science News says they had teeth that crunched through bones, sliced off flesh. They were enormous. Why haven't you been told this in your textbooks? Because it doesn't look like evolution, does it? It looks like devolution, devolving. And so they don't tell you about it. The ground sloths we have today, 5 or 6 feet long, but 20 feet long, and this is what the textbook says. I've seen them twice that size. This one is from the Price Museum of Natural History in Utah. I measured the hand portion. It was 18 inches. They just found one down in Argentina. The hand was twice that size, which would indicate someone twice as big as this one. One of the more common fossils, especially with dinosaurs, are the cattails. We see those in Texas quite often. How tall are cattails? You might see them in Texas, pretty good size, 8, maybe 10 feet. 120 feet tall is not unusual in the fossil record. You can see the little man for scale here. You don't see that today, but it's typical in the fossil record. We're looking here at a modern cycad, a type of fern here in the Dakota School of Mines. I put the quarter up here for scale. This is their sign. But we look in the fossil record, and here from the book Fossil Cycads, true cycads were apparently quite large. One fossil from Japan is a stem over 4 feet in diameter. Today it's like a little, maximum 18-inch fern. Bugs were big. All the bugs were big. Most of them are found in the Pennsylvanian. I think that's because it's not a time era. It is a swamp area where you find a lot of bugs. But notice, not a few of them, not some of them, all of them. This is a beautiful fossil of a dragonfly, 27 inches in wingspan. Do you get the point? Just on and on and on. I excavated a cockroach from near Oblong, Illinois, several years ago, 1.5 feet long. The wife wouldn't let me bring it in the house. It's a rot. No, it's a cockroach. When we look back in the fossil record, obviously we see big things when we look at dinosaurs, and these were enormous. Here's Seismosaurus, maybe 150 feet long. There is one representative of the beakneck family that's still around that remains from this group of animals. Maybe killed off by people that understood what we see when we look at Jurassic Park. We'd rather not have those things around. The only representative today is the tuatara from New Zealand. Same family. He's about 8 inches long. Hadn't evolved a whole lot. What we see in this whole world around us is not an upward process, but a downhill process everywhere, even in the fossil record. Now, animals going downhill, is that because of the second law of thermodynamics? I'm not sure I can prove that, but it sure smells like it. Everything else is going downhill, and we certainly see that indicated in the fossil record. At least it gives me a chance to combat the picture, the lie that's presented with these little graduated horse charts, leaving out my 9-foot donkey, and the graduated man chart, leaving out the Turkana boy, and all of the fossils that are inevitably bigger in the past. It's all going downhill. I think it fits a consistent picture.